Representative Randall, I'm so glad we're having you on Sound Politics because you represent a really important community in Western Washington. Dog moms. I think you have
Oh,
three
yes.
with you in DC, and if I remember right,
Only,
one at least travels with you back and forth to Bremerton. How is that? You got to tell us how that's working out.
no, I only have one with me in DC. My
Okay,
other two are too big to fly, so they stay in Bremerton. But Bad Bunny comes with me. He's a Chihuahua mix.
Bad Bunny,
Bad Bunny, yes.
amazing.
And he spent, let's see, 8 hours in the natural resources budget markup the other day and made not a peep under the table.
What a good guy. What a politics champ.
He does occasionally bark at cyclists and runners and the Capitol Police, but
All right. Well, I mean, no one's perfect. You're listening to Sound Politics. I'm Scott Greenstone, flying solo this week over Tacoma, Kitsap County, in my head at least. Tacoma, Kitsap County, and the Olympic Peninsula. This is a congressional district where, last year, voters did something no district in the nation has done before: send a queer Latina to Congress. Democratic Representative Emily Randall of Bremerton has made headlines in recent weeks for showing up at ICE detention centers, venturing into Republican districts like Spokane to hold town halls. And we wanted to have her on the show to talk about all that, as well as breaking news from this week. Congresswoman Emily Randall, welcome to the show.
so good to join you, Scott. Thanks for having me.
I want to talk about the big news here at the University of Washington. First, 21 students are suspended and banned, allegedly because they were part of a pro-Palestinian protest on Monday night. Demonstrators blocked exits and occupied a building on the Seattle campus. That's the engineering building, which was built with a $10 million donation from Boeing. Protesters want UW to cut ties with Boeing, which supplies missiles and munitions to Israel. The protesters caused potentially on the university campus more than $1 million in damage. They posted a statement online calling the October 7th attack by Hamas a heroic victory, quote unquote. And so UW's president condemned that, and UW police are referring charges against 34 of them to King County prosecutors. I should add, protesters say police threw demonstrators downstairs and slammed bodies to the ground, sending 3 people to the hospital. UW did not confirm that. But I bring all this up to you because the Trump administration is watching very closely. Their task force to combat anti-Semitism, applauded the arrests, but wants to see, quote, policy changes to quell uprisings moving forward. So my question for you is, do you think UW acted appropriately here? Do you think political and financial pressure played a role in how they responded? What is your take on this kind of unfolding story?
I think this is a really challenging moment in international politics, a really challenging moment in domestic politics, and we're seeing such an intersection between efforts to change international policy. The University of Washington, is not a policy maker, but we're also seeing efforts from the Trump administration and congressional Republicans to eliminate free speech.
Hmm.
And that this instance is one example of this intersection. I believe that individuals, that Americans have a very important constitutional right to free speech, to peaceful protest, to demonstrate, to advocate for change, to use our voices. But when it comes to, $1 million of damages, lighting fires, putting your classmates and staff members at risk, that's not a peaceful protest. But I think that this administration is using this instance to continue their attack on institutions of higher education, the ability for people to use their First Amendment right to free speech. We've already seen attacks on the Department of Education. efforts to dismantle an agency that serves to meet the needs of students with disabilities, of students with financial need, to ensure that we have an educated population. We also have seen, attacks on institutions' ability to do research because they use the wrong words in their research, whether that's scientific research that is apolitical, that in which the grant says you must use a diversity of samples, that research is
Yeah.
being stopped. So setting aside whether or not this administration cares about this particular instance and the property damage done at University of Washington, this administration is looking for any opportunity to deny people their right to free speech, to go after educational institutions, and to silence the electorate.
I am curious, their justification for these moves has been, well, we think there's an anti-Semitism problem on US campuses. Do you think that there's any truth to that the federal government needs to be involved in fixing if there is a problem?
I mean, we are seeing rising cases of anti-Semitism, but if the Trump administration wanted to do something about it, then defunding and closing the Office of Civil Rights that investigates anti-Semitism cases and shuttering offices while they're in the midst of investigating cases of anti-Semitism is not the way to solve it.
Yeah. I want to ask one more question before we pivot. I do wonder, you told the publication Jewish Insider last summer, quote, "In Congress, I will support Israel's obligation of self-defense and our country's support for that right." Things are, I would say, escalating in Gaza, with Israel announcing it would, block humanitarian aid and displace much of the population. Has your position evolved at all since last summer? Should the U.S. be reconsidering military aid to Israel?
I think we can, two things can be true. We can support the rights of Palestinians and Israelis to self-govern. We can support Israel's rights to defend itself against a terrorist organization, but we can also, put pressure on our allies to uphold international law, to use U.S. aid in accordance with U.S. law, and to make space for humanitarian aid. I recently signed a letter with colleagues about the importance of allowing humanitarian aid into the people of Gaza. And every member that I talk to, every neighbor agrees that we want to save people's lives. We want to ensure that the people of the Palestinian people and the Israeli people have the ability to live lives that are free of persecution, free of violence, and that they should have the ability to self-govern. And we are seeing real tragedy. And, I don't purport to be an expert on foreign policy, but I do believe that it is my job to listen to my constituents, to bring their voices with me, and to do what I can to advocate for, us to be responsible allies, not to support President Trump and, Bibi Netanyahu's agendas, but to be responsible allies.
I want to pivot to immigration policy. Here, pro-immigrant protesters are celebrating today after an Irish citizen was released from our local Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma. That's Cleona Ward. She's a U.S. green card holder who was imprisoned in Tacoma for decades-old drug and motor vehicle convictions that had been expunged by the state of California. You recently visited that facility where she was held, the Northwest ICE Processing Center. You brought up several concerns about conditions there. What do people like Cleona and I think, Bellingham farm worker activist Alfredo Juarez Zeffirino, I believe he's still there. What are they and others experiencing in that facility from what you've seen?
I mean, one of the most notable things that I saw and learned from my first trip to the Northwest Detention Center, first, but won't be the last for sure, um, is that we've seen like a doubling of the detainees from, the end of last year to when I visited, going from like 700 to 1,400 individuals being detained for longer and longer periods of time. This administration has also done away with the opportunity for folks to be released early at the discretion of ICE leaders at the detention facility. So you have to go to DC to get the ability to release someone early, for their processing or for their court appearances, or if they are not a violent risk to the community. Like that's not good for an overcrowded facility. It's problematic because they still have 40 staff openings. They haven't staffed up at the same rate that they have filled the pods, the beds at this facility. And we're seeing people who are being held for longer and longer periods for more and more minor charges. Right? It's You named two individuals, but there's also a University of Washington woman who was detained, a lab tech who was in the United States legally, who had papers.
Is
We're
that
seeing
Llewellyn
people.
Dixon? Yeah.
Yes. And we're seeing individuals who are being basically like kidnapped from the streets, disappeared into facilities like the Northwest Detention Center for political speech. We talked earlier about this administration's attempt to limit First Amendment rights, and they are using political speech, Facebook posts as a reason to snatch people up and to hold them indefinitely.
I want to talk about something else very important that's happening in your district, which includes
Mhm.
the Port of Tacoma,
Yeah.
that has seen a huge decrease in exports, I think almost 30% between February and May. The ports of Seattle and Tacoma say they expect container imports to decline by
Yeah.
40% this month. What are you telling your constituents to prepare for?
Yeah. I've been to visit the Port of Tacoma, and I was just chatting on the way back to my office with folks from the Northwest Seaport Alliance,
Mm,
which is the Port of Tacoma and the Port of Seattle. And, I get asked often in the district, like, are we at risk of tariffs on this? Are we
mm,
at risk of attacks on this? And what I tell folks is, under this administration, I don't think anything is safe. I don't think there's a bridge too far for Donald Trump's efforts to use tariffs indiscriminately for, I don't know, ego, for power, to please his big donors, to, siphon money from working people into tax breaks for billionaires. Like, nothing is sacred. And that's a really scary place to be as a first time Congress member, but
mm.
also for a business that is trying to plan, trying to prepare, and for an economy like Washington's that is so dependent on trade. For fishermen in Washington whose seafood is part of the global seafood market, for folks who don't even live in my district, but who are exporting, their grains and other produce to other markets through the Port of Tacoma, for the longshoremen whose jobs are dependent on a bustling port infrastructure. I'm telling folks that we have to do everything that we can to fight back against these arbitrary and capricious, dangerous decisions, and tell the story of the risks to our economy so that business interests will care too.
Hmm. You mentioned you're a freshman. There's another freshman from Washington State on the other side of the state, right? Spokane's Republican Congressman Michael Baumgartner. And he has expressed skepticism in interviews about tariffs. And I wonder that, there have been some efforts spearheaded by other Republicans to scale back the tariffs. Those have stalled so far. You have talked about reaching across the aisle. Have you been working your Republican colleagues at all to try and get movement on the tariffs? I mean, maybe
Yeah.
Congressman Baumgartner?
I've had a number of conversations with Congressman Baumgartner about a number of policy areas. We spent a lot of time together at
Yeah.
orientation, and I find him to be a pretty nice guy who is reasonable on a lot of issues. And, I am hopeful that members like Mike and, other level-headed Republicans from around the country will continue using their voices, whether it's publicly in interviews or whether it's, privately behind the scenes. It's not just districts like, ours that are impacted by tariff wars, by attacks on Medicaid, by attacks on Social Security, by, defunding NOAA, the National Weather Service. It affects every district in the country, and certainly agricultural districts like Representative Baumgartner.
Yeah. I want to stay in Spokane with Congressman Baumgartner really quick to talk about broader efforts to oppose President Trump. You showed up for what you called a People's Town Hall in Spokane recently in Representative Baumgartner's district, not your own, right? Why did you want to meet with people you don't necessarily represent in Congress, and what did you learn from the audience there?
Yeah, so this was a state party event. So, no resources of my official office were used in organizing or, flying to visit Spokane. But I think folks, not just Democrats, but a lot of Democrats around the country are scared and anxious and uncertain about what's happening. And, I think as an elected politician, I have the responsibility to try and help my neighbors understand what's going on and to listen to their concerns and their stories. And I was a little disappointed in some of the Republicans' members' responses to Democrats showing up at their town halls, calling them paid Soros protesters when they're really just neighbors, right? Just people who deserve to be frustrated by their representation, if that's how they feel, who have First Amendment rights to speak out against their elected representatives. And so I figured I'd show up, I'd listen to real people who live in Spokane, like my grandparents did, and, see if I could answer any other questions.
Yeah. Is there purely on like a strategic level, is there a downside to doing a town hall in your Republican colleagues' district? Because you and like you mentioned, you and Representative Baumgartner started off your terms pretty friendly. There's that picture of you two sharing the chick pic that our listeners will remember from a couple months back, an episode about the tradition in the Washington State delegation. Are you like, is going on offense? Are you shutting a potential door at a crucial time by going to his district and holding a town hall?
I mean, that's certainly a risk. And, I weighed that. I was like, oh, should I even do this? But I went and I saw him in the hallway afterwards. I was like, I didn't say mean things about you, Mike. I just wanted to show up to listen to, Democrats who don't know what's going on. And
What did
I'm
he say
hopeful
to
that it
that?
won't end our friendly relationship.
Yeah. What did he say?
He just, smiled at me and said, okay. And he, gave a quote in a Spokesman Review article that said it's just seemed to him like party activity. And, political parties do this kind of thing.
I'm thinking about a post that you put on Instagram last month after federal officials arrested two judges. You said, "We are in the middle of an aggressive constitutional crisis. Trump believes that he is king." And I know you're not the only person to say this, but I'm curious if you still believe that. I am hearing that a lot. And what I don't hear as much is what that means for everyone who is not a Republican in Congress, right? You kind of implied that Republicans in Congress need to check presidential power. And for the rest of us who are not, Republicans in Congress, like, what are you encouraging the public to do? If we are in the middle of an aggressive constitutional crisis, like you say.
I mean, I think, in the history of government, it's not other people in government that save us from government. That's how many times can I say government, right? but it's the power of people who push back, use their voices at the ballot box and in community. And I think, what I have been talking to folks about is that we have three sort of spheres of battle. We have Congress, where we have a lot of messaging tools, where we have connections to media like you, where we can speak in committee, where we can introduce procedural amendments and discharge petitions. Like there's one right now where we've got signatures to pull a bill to the floor to protect Medicaid. And then there's the courts, which are another, separate branch of government, a check and balance on the executive branch, where we're seeing real success from Democratic attorneys general, like our own Nick Brown, from the ACLU, from Human Rights Campaign, from organizations that are bringing lawsuits against the Trump administration. And many of us in Congress are signing amicus briefs in support of those cases. While we can't be, the plaintiffs ourselves, because the Speaker of the House has to lead a congressional lawsuit against the president, we can join and support. And then the other sphere, it's Congress, it's courts, and it's a community. And then, I show up alongside my neighbors for hands-off protests. I encourage people to use their voices in new ways. I encourage people to write letters to the editor, to call their friends, classmates, former coworkers who live in districts where their members are not standing up for their values, and to make calls into those offices, right? We have to have an old-fashioned phone tree because it's people putting pressure on their members that change their votes. We've seen, congressional Republicans weaken a little bit on this budget reconciliation package regarding cuts to Medicaid. There was a meeting with the Speaker on Tuesday with some moderate members who are backing off, who are, saying they're not willing to support cuts to Medicaid. And I think that's in large part because their constituents have been showing up and using their voices. So I don't want to let people undervalue their own role in our democracy. It's not just voting. There are a lot of things that people can do to be active participants in fighting back.
Emily Randall represents Washington's 6th Congressional District in the House of Representatives. Representative Randall, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Scott. Always a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Sound Politics today. That's our show. It is edited every week by Gabriel Spitzer, and this week our producer was Gabrielle Healy. I'm Scott Greenstone, and if you love Sound Politics, consider a donation. I want to give a shout out to Kara, who I missed when she gave in March. Kara, thank you for donating. She gave through the main KUOW donation form on the front page of the website, which is totally fine. But if you want a shout out on the show, give at KUOW.org/politics. We'll see you next week.